Begin the program. Thank you all for coming out, braving the elements, and your good, hardy Kansas Pioneer stock. Just be glad we're not up in Iowa and Illinois today. My name is Tim Ruis, and I'm the administrator here at Constitution Hall. And first and foremost, I want to thank Vicki Lechner. Vicki, are you back there? And Charlene Winter, Charlene Wade, for the great snacks we have here today. And want to recognize the Madam Mayor, Sandy Jocko, today. Thanks, Sandy, for coming out. And Patrick Zollner. Patrick, raise your hand. Patrick, State Historical Society, Director of Historic Sites and Preservation Department. And with that, we have two panelists here today to talk about Alexander Gardner photographs through Kansas in 1867. Unfortunately, James Sherbert, Dr. Sherbert, History Department at K-State, called, said he didn't want to brave the elements and the roads to come out from Manhattan. They got a lot more snow out there. But we do have one of the co-authors here today, and this gentleman here is John Charlton. And joining John in our panel discussion is this nice lady right here. This is Nancy Sherbert, a colleague of mine at the Kansas Historical Society. Nancy is curator of photographs, kind of the institutional memory of the library archives, particularly of photographs. And I know you didn't come here today to listen to me talk, so I'm going to step aside and give you John Charlton, and Nancy Sherbert. But before that, I need to recognize an announcement by this fine lady right here. This is Deb Beisel, and she's at the historic Topeka Cemetery.
On February 2nd, 1859, in this very building, historic Topeka Cemetery was chartered. That makes us the oldest chartered cemetery in the state of Kansas. Obviously, you're burying people, whenever and wherever the need arises, but as far as having a charter, we were the first one. So I brought with me today a couple of posters Tim put back there in the break room. Those are the newspaper accounts from the death of Vice President Charles Curtis. And he, of course, is our highest ranking resident, I guess you would say, at the cemetery. We just had a program last week on his life and all the folks connected in the cemetery that would have been connected, him and his wife, family and colleagues. And downstairs, I've got a couple of notebooks. We have a friends group that meets every Wednesday. It's a standing meeting. We meet every Wednesday morning at 11 o'clock at the cemetery office, and we just kind of BS and get off tangents and whatever. But we put together some really awesome research, and I've got a couple of notebooks with me. One of them is on Curtis, and again, his relatives and connections. The other one is on the World War I fatalities that are in the cemetery. These are people who died in service. Some were killed in action, some died of disease. We have one woman who was actually a secretary of the War Department when she died from influenza. So while we're marking the anniversary of World War I, we mark their graves at Veterans Day and Memorial Day with their biographies. So I'd invite you to take a look at those, and we have some brochures downstairs if you want to join our friends group. But just come by and see us. We're doing some really interesting things, and it's such a significant historic site, and we're just so pleased to celebrate that great connection to Lecompton. But thank you all very much.
Thank you, Deb. Deb Beisel, Historic Cemetery, and with that, John Charlton, Nancy Sherbert, and thank you all for coming out today.
Yes, thanks, Tim. I'm just going to give a really short presentation on Alexander Gardner and his project, or his series of photographs across Kansas on the Union Pacific Eastern Division. Because I think John is going to pass around his book for you to take a look at, but at this point I just wanted to just give you just a few slides so that you'll know more about him. Alexander Gardner, a Scotsman, was born in 1821, and he came to the United States in 1856. Soon after his arrival, he started working for the famous photographer Matthew Brady. Some historians think that Brady subsidized Gardner's trip to America. What we do know is that the two experts on collodion wet plate negative photography became acquainted, and Gardner worked for Brady. In 1858, 2 years after his arrival, Gardner was placed in charge of Brady's Washington, D.C. gallery. When the Civil War broke out, he followed Brady into the battlefields and took photographs. Gardner continued working for Brady until he opened his own gallery in 1863. It was at this shop in Washington, D.C. that he took several well-known photographs of President Abraham Lincoln. You probably are all familiar with those. During the last years of the Civil War, Gardner followed the Army of the Potomac and took photographs of battle scenes. Actually, it was he and his brother James also helped him. In 1866, Gardner published a 2-volume work titled Sketchbook of the War, which is chiefly a collection of original photographs. It's one of the most important sources of the Civil War. However, it was financially unsuccessful for Gardner. A year later, in 1867, he closed his Washington, D.C. gallery and headed west in a horse-drawn darkroom. And this is just a photograph of his outfit. I have to sort of tell you just a little bit about photography. Photography was introduced into the United States in about 1838 or 1839. He started taking his photographs out in the field in 1867. So you see that over 29 years, photography had progressed quite quickly. And it's amazing. I'm always amazed every time I look at this particular photograph that any of his plates survived, or that any photographer's plates survived. Because some photographers would have pack animals, or they would have a horse-drawn carriage. Just some of the things he might have carried in his dark room would be the glass, and he would cut his own glass, the chemicals, the cameras, the tripods, and other equipment and supplies. I'll have to tell you, there's a great description of the collodion wet negative in John's book, and it's at the very beginning of the book, that you'll have to take a look at it and read. Buy a copy and read. I also have to tell you that exposures at that time were very long, so maybe 5 to 30 seconds. So it was difficult, and sometimes you'll notice in some of Gardner's photographs there's sort of a blur, and that's because something had moved. In that same year, 1867, Gardner was hired to document the building of the Union Pacific Railway Eastern Division. He traveled first to St. Louis and then to Wyandotte, Kansas, which is now Kansas City, where the offices of the Union Pacific Railway Eastern Division were located. I have to mention this. We do have a couple of stereographs that Alexander Gardner took of St. Louis. I didn't bring any slides of those, but we do have a couple of views of St. Louis. But this is probably one of the first that he took in Kansas. The railroad was built from about this point. He started his trip. The railroad was begun in 1863. It was originally the Leavenworth, Pawnee, and Western, and it was later changed to the Union Pacific Eastern Division. Slowed by the war, it picked up construction pace in 1867. And the end of the track where Gardner reached it, which was about 70 miles or several miles west of Hays, Kansas. For your railroad buffs, the Union Pacific Eastern Division became the Kansas Pacific in 1869, and then later the Union Pacific in 1880. But luckily for us, he didn't limit his views or his photography to the railroad line. Instead, he made side trips to Leavenworth and country between Leavenworth and Lawrence. And he went to Lecompton. Also, he took photographs of bridge building, ferry operation, Indian missions, rock formations, military posts, and prairie dogs. Obviously, he was you could tell from some of his photography that he was very interested in the landscape of Kansas. Gardner's stereographs all contain on the reverse side the following information. From Gardner's Photographs Art Gallery, 511 7th Street, Washington, across the continent on the Union Pacific Railway, Eastern Division. In addition, they all bear a serial number, a title, and the distance expressed in miles west of St. Louis, Missouri. The larger photographs occasionally have handwritten information, but they usually have printed on them across the continent on the Union Pacific Railway Eastern Division. Gardner produced photographs in several sizes, and they ranged from 6 by 8 to 11 by 14 in inches, in addition to the stereographs. And I did bring some samples of the larger format photographs. Two of those photographs both were taken in Lecompton, as well as some of the stereographs. And the reverse, you can see what it says on the back of one of the stereographs, as well as some enlargements of some of the stereographs, just one side, so you could really see the detail. After photographing the Union Pacific Railway Eastern Division, Gardner traveled throughout the West taking photographs. In the spring of 1868, he photographed the peace conference between the United States government and Arapaho and Cheyenne at Fort Laramie. After his Western tour, Gardner returned to Washington, D.C. Now, let's fast forward to 1930. This was the year that the Kansas State Historical Society purchased 150 Gardner stereos from Miss Crete Rose of Lenham, Maryland. She told us that this set of views had been in her family since her father's childhood. Here are just a few of the photographs in the collection. This is 5th Street in Leavenworth, and you'll notice that you can see his photography outfit right here. And this is Massachusetts Street in Lawrence. And on our right is the Eldridge. And here's the Eldridge house. And here's a view of Kansas Avenue in Topeka.
Not much of a going concern, is it?
No, it's not. And this, I think, is one of the most interesting. This is construction on the State House. And this is Lincoln College, which was at the corner of 10th and Jackson, where the memorial building where the Kansas State Historical Society was once located. This is where that was located. Lincoln College eventually became Washburn College and Washburn University. If you sort of see here in the foreground of the stereograph are stones that were used for building the State House. Here's a view of Lecompton, and actually Tim has an enlargement of this particular view that we'll put out in just a little bit. It's sort of hard to see all the buildings that are in this particular photograph, but when you look at John's, it's much better to see them. And here's the Lecompton State House Foundation, which eventually became part, or I guess Lane University was built at this site. Here's a view of a ferry across the Kansas River at Lecompton, and the original is over here on the table. And then here's a view of Lane University, or I guess it also was known as the Rowena Hotel. In 1978, the Kansas State Historical Society was able to purchase 8 large format photographs. Let me go back. And among those, we were able to purchase images of the Indian hieroglyphic rocks at Smoky Hill River, a camp at Fort Harker, this view of the ferry across the Kansas River at Lecompton, the Bluemont College in Manhattan, a depot at Manhattan, a construction train was taken just west of Hayes that would have been at the end of the track, Castle Rock, and again, this Lane University photograph. Probably one of the foremost historians, who I think one of the first people who actually started researching Alexander Gardner was a man named Robert Taft. And he was a professor at the University of Kansas. He wrote several articles on Gardner, and they both are published in the Kansas Quarterly. And I'd be glad to give you those sites. They actually are online. He also, I think probably one of the best books on 19th century photography was written by Robert Taft. And I have a copy up here. It's called Photography in the American Scene, and it's still available for sale. And I think it's not only gives you information about Gardner, but other 19th century photographers and the processes that they used. We have a wonderful website called kansasmemory.org. And I brought some handouts for it, and you're welcome to all take one so that you can go home and sit at your computer and just drink your coffee and look at photographs. You can read letters, you can look at artifacts, maps, but you can even read books. It's a great site, and all of the Gardner photographs are on kansasmemory.org. I think that's about all I have to tell you about Gardner. It was probably in the 1990s that John and I became friends. He was doing research on Gardner, and we started sharing notes, and he was looking at our photographs, and he was ordering photographs, and became quite interested in his project that ultimately developed into a book, and that was his rephotography. And I'll turn it over to John, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have about the collection, or even the collections of the Historical Society. Yes?
Do any of the negatives survive?
I don't know, John, not to my knowledge. I'm not sure what happened to the actual negatives. We're just glad that the prints survived.
Now, I got a hold of some glass plates that were from Chicago in the early period, and I was surprised at the number of people in and out of photography that weren't remotely interested, not even the Historical Society.
Really?
Yeah, it was, and I printed them. I'm an amateur photographer, and I took them down in my darkroom. They were 5x7, and I was surprised at the clarity of the prints that I got off of these old glass negatives. And they were just thrown in cardboard boxes underneath the stairwell in this old gentleman's home, and you couldn't give them away.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I thought so too, and it is that important later on. And here are pictures in and around the city that grew up to be something, and people were just kind of passé.
Did you contact print from?
Yes, that's what I did.
That's why they're so
Yes,
sharp.
and they were
That's right.
absolutely, you could see the lace and the not to belabor this, but the dress of the period, and the ladies had these big hats and the high collars and the brooches, and you could see all of that. It was amazing.
Well, that's one thing, when we first moved, when I started working in the Historical Society, we had a dark room, and we actually did contact prints, and you're right, the clarity of the prints is amazing, and I don't think there's anything that even compares.
Yeah. And the thing was, all of these people looking back at you from hundreds or half a century or more away, and I thought, what were their lives like? What did they do, and what did they think? And all the upheavals that we read about in history books, all of a sudden it became personal. Here, and the issue was people, well, I don't know that. Well, you don't know a lot of people, but just the period of time that it represented. And the funny thing is about moving, there was a picture taken in front of a bar, bunch of fellas with bowlers. And the only guy that moved was the guy holding the newspaper. It says Chicago Tribune, but you can't make out the date. Everybody else is stock still. I'd like to talk to that guy.
Yeah, why did he move? Kate, did you have a question?
Oh, just about the optics, what kind of camera apparatus was he using to get such great resolution?
Well,
Did you know, John, what kind of camera he used?
He used several cameras. The stereographic camera, which is a fairly small format, but it's in 3D. And then he brought his Washington portrait camera along, since he was going to be on the train. And it photographs 11 by 14 inch glass plates.
Wow.
And they contact print off of those plates. And they have the clarity that you're talking about.
but they had to coat those plates in that wagon. And I did that to practice. It's ASA 6, if anybody's familiar with photography. It was 5.
That's pretty slow.
Really slow, trying to get a picture of my wife and our son in our basement with this old 5x7 wooden view camera. That's why people look so staunch. Because they had to
Don't
sit.
move.
Yeah, don't move. Yeah, it was, I'm thinking, can you imagine now 11 by 14 piece of glass
Yeah.
that he had to coat in that wagon and then get it in the camera in the dark.
Yeah.
And it was wet.
Wet.
Wet, yes, yeah. It was a treat, to say the least.
I did bring a stereoscope, if anybody would like to take a look at a stereograph and see the 3D effect over there. So please help me take a look.
It's a wonder that these people had the foresight to do that. What drove
I
that
know.
to go into the wilderness?
And 10 years later, you know, he would be able to go out on this type of a project. I mean, they were doing ambrotypes, maybe 10 types, but you just didn't have the ability to process them or take images of it outside in some cases.
It's cool.
What did the railroad do with these pictures, and did other railroads use photographers too, and for what purpose?
Oh, yes, they did use photographers, yeah, because we have some photographers' work that were on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. Of course, we have the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe corporate records and their photographs in our collection. And yes, they did have photographers going out and taking photographs. But I'll let you answer that. They did do some portfolios of.
This is the way they were competing with each other for government largesse, to show people in Washington the progress of the railroad and who should get the encouragement to build. And so they were actually made to promote the railroad and the progress and the development that the railroad brought with it. It usually followed the train, and that's largely what the context of this book is about. The train was literally the engine of progress and the transformation of the Western landscape and the populations and the culture and the agriculture and everything. And it really is displayed wonderfully in the Gardner series. And I've tried to rephotograph all of those images as carefully as possible, matching the time of day and the time of year, so you can actually use the paired old and new images to see the change over nearly a century and a half. And
Can everybody hear John? Do you want to come?
John, stand up so you can see.
I don't know whether to backtrack or not. What was I talking about?
Reproducing the photographs.
Oh, yeah, that's really what my project was. It was a rephotographic survey based on Gardner's series. And it began with the stereographic series at with Nancy's help at the Historical Society, and then learned there were these other collections around the country of large format versions of these images, going up to the images at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles that are the imperial photographs made with the portrait camera that Gardner used to photograph Lincoln and all these important people back in Washington. He brought it out here and did the first pictures really of the West ever made, west of the Missouri River anyway. And those are comprise what the Historical Society's collection is. And as far as I know, it's the most and probably the only complete collection of the stereographs. Not very few were made, and so the series are very rare. And recently, the Nelson Museum staged a major exhibit of them. It just came down last month, but there's a very nice catalog that was with that series. It was with the Plains Indian exhibit there too. And they sold our book along with the catalogs to those two exhibits there. And that was just fortuitous. Our book had just come out when that exhibit was up. So it was a great venue to sell a book. Any time you have questions, I don't have a very organized presentation to give. Most of the pictures that Nancy has shown from the Stereograph series are in the book. The bulk of it is comprised of the larger format images. There's about 60 pairs of those, including nearly all the ones at the Getty. And then there's about 30 pairs of from the Stereograph series there too. And my co-author, Jim Sherbert, was going to be here today, except they had about 6 inches of snow out near Manhattan where he was coming from, so he didn't make it. And I'm kind of sorry, I was kind of counting on him being here to actually describe what we tried to, the context of what we tried to do with the pictures. My focus had always been on collecting the pictures, recognizing what they were, where they were taken, when they were taken, and to redo them. And it started off as a project that, while I worked at the Geological Survey at KU, and we were trying to get grant funding to support it. And originally it was supposed to be a 3-year project, and this was back in the early 90s. And the grant didn't work out. Jim and I put together a huge NEH grant the same year that Newt Gingrich cut the budget to that agency in half. So that when that failed, it was no longer an official project, it became my hobby. And it was pretty much my full-time hobby for about 20 years. And it took all my vacations and weekends and travel time. But I did go visit all the collections that I was aware of that I could find around the country. And at the Getty, I was able to spend 2 whole days poring over the imperial prints with a magnifying glass and taking notes. And you can read all the signage in the pictures off of those and recognize people's faces and who they were. And some of those are in this book as well, which I have some copies to sell and sign if you are interested.
How long was Gardner in Kansas taking these photographs?
There's a lot of documents associated with the pictures. A lot of them are in the Historical Society, both railroad company documents, diaries. There's an account of the early part of the series that was taken by William Bell in a book he published in 1869 called New Tracks Across North America. He was the original photographer hired by the company to take these pictures kind of at the last minute. And he really didn't, he was a physician, he didn't really know much about photography. He learned real quickly, but not very well. And he was replaced by Gardner when his pictures failed. And he was out here in June of 1867, which was a spring that there were big floods all across the state. And that pretty much skunked him too. And but some of the pictures in the series are by Bell, actually. Some that did turn out. And then Gardner replaced him probably in late August. I think there's a letter by William Palmer dated in August that Gardner had met him out at Fort Larned. So apparently, before he started photographing, he went and met William Palmer, who was the head of all surveys, railroad surveys for the company. And then I think he had taken pictures in St. Louis, and those are at the beginning of the series. And then he started photographing in Kansas, I believe in early September. And the last dated image of the series, some of the pictures have dates on the mounting boards, and it was in late October. And I think he went from far western Kansas down to New Mexico to meet Palmer and replaced Bell down there. And that was in October. So he was probably in Kansas for about 6 weeks. But he took hundreds of pictures. They're not all in any collection. Some of them are scattered around Europe. And at some point I read that, while he was still in Kansas, that in a letter that said he'd taken over 400 views.
Wow.
So even though I've got most of the extant views from the collections that are known, there were lots of plates, probably some of them lost, that I'm still finding new ones every once in a while. You've acquired some new ones.
Just a few.
Yeah, they're very rare.
They are very rare and very expensive, yeah.
But just what you were saying, the amount of time, I thought it would have been years.
Me too, or a
He
year
was just
at
a real
least.
prolific. He was the best
Wow.
photographer in the country.
Knowing how to go from border to border
Yeah.
in the state of Kansas, horse-drawn vehicle.
Wow.
Well, no, he was on the train most of the time. He got off the train with his wagon from time to time, because there were other things he was interested in besides the railroad. He was particularly interested in the Plains Indians, because the treaties were being signed back in Washington, and the tribal leaders would come back to Washington to sign the treaties, and he would photograph them in his studios. And there's a huge collection of his Indian portraiture from Washington at the Smithsonian. It's one of the largest collections of Plains tribe views. And after he did the railroad series, he went out to Fort Laramie with General Sherman and several other generals to sign treaties out there, and took pictures. And they were included in the exhibit that was at the Nelson, and they're just amazing. They're the first pictures taken of the Plains tribes in the Plains, and some of the last, actually. Tim?
John, you and I have discussed this. Of course, Lecompton is on the south bank of the Kansas River, which is the Santa Fe side. And Gardner took photographs of Union City, Kansas, which is on the north bank. And after the presentation, I dropped the screen, you'll see a bird's eye view of Lecompton. So he came into Lecompton to photograph this town. And of course, this building that we're sitting in was built in 1856, so it would have been around at the time he was in town photographing, and I know we've talked about.
It's in that picture.
Right, it's at the bird's eye view, but I'm sure he would have taken a up-close photograph of this building because of the Constitution of Britain, all the controversy that took place in this building. Your theory is you think that the plate was lost, broken?
I've never seen it. I think there is a good likelihood he did because he took pictures of the Capitol Foundation and the Lane Museum, or university back then, that was the Rowena Hotel before. And so he probably took pictures of everything around here, you know. He took pictures of some guys looking in a well over, you know, just south of town. So that's in your collection
But if anyone would
too.
like to see the bird's eye view of the Capitol, I'll drop the screen.
Do you wanna go ahead and drop
I think we're through with the,
Unless you want to look, that's a beautiful building, the Rowena. I like to look at that.
yeah, this print, that's a inkjet print that is from the Imperial collection at the Getty Museum. And they gave us permission to reproduce it for Constitution Hall. And the hall is in the picture. You can identify most of the buildings in the Compton in this picture. And it's, of course, an enlargement from the Imperial view, but it just shows the detail, you know, holds up. I think Tim's got things marked out on here identifying the buildings in the Gardner picture. This didn't make it in the book. I had to cut some pictures in. I chose the combinations by the strength of the two pictures. And mine, even though this is a great picture of Lecompton, the view that I replaced it
I've done
with
this before, so.
is pretty much overgrown, and I can't really see across the valley in it. So that wasn't included. But of course, you got it right here, the original Gardner view.
So when you say rephotographing, do you mean photographing the photographs, or do you mean
No.
photographing the same scenes?
The same
of
scene from the same vantage
years
point.
later?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Could you explain that, what you went through to do that?
Well, gathering copy images from the collections was the beginning, and organizing them and collating them from the different collections, and using the railroad mileage numbers on the mounting boards was a big key to keeping track of what was where, you know, and using the previous one and the next one to actually use mileage. Because the images are nothing alike. I mean, the old and new pictures are just completely transformed. But I also used city bird's eye maps from 1869, and they're included in the book, and they are almost exactly the same views in Gardner's pictures. I mean, you can identify the streets and the locations and the buildings and the subjects in the bird's eye maps. So that was a great help. And then finding documents associated with the pictures, you know, the historical documents, that helped nail down times, because I really wanted to have the shadows match up between the old and new pictures. Sometimes that's all that matches up. But to do that, it had to be the same time of year and the same time of day. And then the environmental conditions would be comparable too. And Jim especially wrote about that. That's kind of his specialty at K-State, is environmental history. And he used that theme to pull together the series in the book and describe how, as the tracks were built, and, you know, hell on wheels kept moving west, farther and farther west. Behind it came the immigrants, and and ahead of it really fled the Plains tribes and the bison, and the prairies were replaced by farms and agriculture and European culture, really, replacing the native culture.
I have a question about the picture of the Rowena Hotel, which stood up here, which is now the corner of the park. So when you photographed that, did you just photograph the park?
Yeah,
or-
it's an empty space. I mean, it's a park, and it even has a little sign that says Rowena Park in it. But, you know, I take it as it comes. The idea was to be accurate as possible. And some of the picture pairs, like I say, are stronger than others, and that was how I chose what would go into the book, and why some things were left out. We couldn't include everything. Yes.
What equipment did you use?
Well, that's kind of interesting because, you know, Gardner was brought over here by Brady to instruct his staff on how to do the new British wet plate collodion process and the albumin printing process for mass producing photographs, which previously Brady just was a daguerreotypist, and the daguerreotype, is it copper?
Yes,
The
but
cop-
it's just a single image.
Yeah, and it wasn't a negative, so it couldn't be reprinted. And so to become commercially, you know, successful with this new image, he needed to have somebody come over and train his people to do it, and that was Alexander Gardner. And while I was photographing in the early 90s, I used silver chemical-based photography, which had long replaced, you know, the wet collodion plate. And because this thing took so long, all that became obsolete while I was working on it. And it was all replaced by digital images and Photoshop. And I had to learn all that. And so I kind of went through the same kind of transition in the time I was photographing that had happened, you know, the previous century with Gardner. So it's kind of a interesting parallel. In fact, the last picture I took that made it in the book of the new Bowersock North powerhouse on the Kansas River in Lawrence, I took with my telephone, you know. And I would never imagined doing that, you know, when I started off.
Was it the proper time of day, though?
Yeah,
That's good.
it was the same technique that way. Yes.
Were you using 35 millimeter or something larger?
I used both. I used an old stereo realist camera to reproduce the stereographs, so that it would be in 3D. And that series, I did that while I was at the survey, and they put it on their website with anaglyphic 3D. If you've got the magenta and blue glasses, you can look at the old and new series on the survey website in 3D. And then I used a 4x5 view camera to reproduce the 16 by 20 imperial plates, because it's, you know, comparable aspect ratio. I could blow those up and they would match Gardner's.
I noticed years ago when I was learning photography, a friend of mine would go out with these 4x5 field camera and 6 film backs. And I show up with my 35 millimeter with 36 exposure rolls. If you use a view camera, you tend to pay more attention to composition, the content in the film.
That's because everything's upside down
Upside
and
down
backwards.
However, you said, John, you're not really taking pictures. You're not looking at what you're shooting, because it's bang, 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 because I can afford it.
Huh.
And he would take half an hour to set up that camera for one shot. But they were beautiful when he got finished, this type of thing. Paid attention to what he was really looking at.
I've done a previous book, that's kind of how I got interested in the reef photography and looked for the Gardner project, which I found in Taft's book and then at the Historical Society. It was I went down the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon with some geologists and rephotographed images that were taken in a 1921 expedition by the USGS that Raymond Moore from the Geological Survey was the geologist for. It was the first really thorough mapping of the Colorado River, and lots of photographs were taken with it. And we found some in Raymond Moore's archives up at KU and used those as a basis of rephotographing, which later became a book and an exhibit. I was really pumped up from doing that. It was really exciting and looking for something else to transition to when I encountered the Gardner series right here in Kansas. It was amazing.
I was interested in the images on the cover. Can you tell us about those and why you chose them for the cover?
Well, I didn't choose them for the cover. I might not have chosen them. This book was published by the University of New Mexico Press, which is really renowned for producing this kind of book. I'm just really glad that Jim Sherbert had the contacts down there to have it done there, because they have terrific layout artists and they just did a beautiful job in putting this book together. And I think they just picked a pretty combination of pictures. It is. It's nice. It's near Linwood, actually, along the railroad track. And I think it was probably taken by Gardner's brother James, who came out here with him. And for instance, the picture Nancy showed, Gardner in the wagon, would have been taken by James. And James took some of them. And he worked with Gardner in Washington and came out here to help him take the series. Yes.
Can you tell us about what happened with Gardner after he was done here, lived the rest of his life, and his relationship with Matthew Brady?
Well, that's a kind of an interesting subject that is kind of open to some conjecture, because he did leave Brady's employ early on in the Civil War, and they apparently had a falling out over who got credit for the pictures. And they were going out to battlefields during battles, taking pictures and risking their lives, just so Matthew Brady could make the profit from the pictures, and he wasn't giving them credit. I don't think Brady took any Civil War pictures.
Oh.
But that's, my conjecture. But, he was a daguerreotypist. He had Gardner come here from England to teach the new technique to his employees. And then when Gardner left Brady, he took his employees with him. And Brady had thick glasses and was nearly blind. And I think he'd long stopped taking photographs by the time of the Civil War. But he outlived Gardner by about 20 years. And he bought up every photograph he could find of the Civil War and patented them and put his name on them. And that, I believe, is why he's credited for taking them. But he just happened to own them. Yeah, he was relatively young, but photography will kill you, especially with the chemicals. I don't miss that at all.
Could you maybe give a brief explanation that non-photographers could understand? What is daguerreotype photography and what is collodion photography?
Yeah, well, that might be something Nancy.
Well, the daguerreotype was a single image sheet. I should have brought some. It's a highly polished sheet of copper, And they would expose that, and then they would process it. I think they used mercury in the processing, and so a lot of photographers became, had some health issues because of it. But it was one single plate, so there wasn't like you could take it and make multiple images. It was just one image on a plate.
So the photographs were on metal and
And
not.
they were small.
Right, and they would put them, they're very small, and they would put them in like cases, and so you might see like a daguerreotype, ambrotypes, and tintypes, you might see in cases, and they were sort of interchangeable. But yeah, the daguerreotype was the earliest type of photography, one of the earliest types of photography.
And they were backwards.
And they were backwards, and you could tell a daguerreotype because it had this highly polished. It was like almost like a mirror. You could turn it, and it was like a mirror.
They're beautiful.
They're gorgeous.
And you had one, it
They're like
was
jewels.
an original.
It
Each
was.
shot
There was-
was an original.
Yeah, there was nothing
And you
else.
had to imagine the left is right and right is left.
Mhm.
So it's like looking at a negative, but you could make it out. It was,
And that's the same with the others too, that were just single image bearing plates.
But the collodion print was, collodion was a emulsion that was put together on the spot in a portable darkroom, like which Gardner did, and then coated on a plate, a glass plate, and made a negative. And then they would contact print the albumin prints off of that negative. And they didn't do enlargements back then, I don't believe. So they were all contact printed. And that's why they're so detailed and useful for reading history and photographs,
and
about as good as it can get.
we were talking earlier about the detail in those old contact prints. They are alive. If you see one of these originals, it's amazing. The information that was captured on those old cameras with no shutter, you just pulled the cap off, 1001, 1002, 1003, it's got back on. The original print, the contact print, is alive. It has detail and clarity that I don't know we can reproduce that, I guess, today.
Well, when you
Come
enlarge
closer.
something, it stretches out the image and it's not as clear as the original negative that, it replaced the collodion process because that was so cumbersome and esoteric, very few people could do it.
But if you get an old one, I love the old books that have illustrations not like this. And you can look into that picture as deep as you want to go.
Well, that's what this is.
It's, they're
John?
wonderful.
When did the first photography technology arise? When were the first photographs?
Well,
I
they
think
were,
it was introduced into the United States in 1838, 1839,
Those are the earliest photographs of
in America.
in America.
It developed in Europe,
Yes.
both in France and England.
Uh-huh.
What
you had mentioned earlier, right?
Probably the early 1800s. There's some rivalry, among the French and the English about who did what when. They both would claim to have been the first one.
Taft's book is a great source of information on early photography, if you're interested. I just wanted to add one other thing because I wanted to promote kansasmemory.org. And I will pass out some information on kansasmemory.org. But Robert Taft's notes and correspondence for his book are on Kansas Memory if you're interested in reading that. So it's not only his photographs, some of the photographs that he collected, but also his notes and correspondence for that book.
Robert Taft was a chemistry professor at KU. So he was very interested in these 19th century processes, and he would reproduce them, and he became the director of the State Historical Society in the 30s, and that's when he acquired the Gardner stereo series and wrote about them for the first time.
And he collected wonderful images.
Yes.
My image of a photographer is the man with the little camera, and he's got the black thing over, and he's got something in his hand, and he looks in, and then he steps to one side, and this big poof happens. What photograph style was that?
That would have been more of a studio style, because he would have used the
daguerreotype?
phosphorus flash to illuminate, where there wasn't sufficient light. But it would be redundant to do that outside usually.
Is that a daguerreotype? Is that the?
I think that was probably more with the albumin.
Later.
Collodion.
Well, I knew that was in, but I was wondering what's.
But the daguerreotypists were usually, studio photographers that had, overhead lights in their studios, and it was even a longer exposure for those. They would actually have people sit with racks, against their back to try to keep them to hold still for several minutes during an exposure, and they probably wasted a lot of, had a lot of failures that way too. So it was very technical and difficult process.
Yes, the daguerreotype, what actually made the image? It wasn't printed like an engraving plate or anything, was it the emulsion on the plate?
Well, photography, it means light writing. So it was light going through the lens focused on the film plate. That's what all photography is, really. I think it's the basis of digital photography too. It's light coming through the lens focused on the plate.
But just the plate by itself, would that make an image, light exposed to it, especially if it's copper? Or was there something else on that plate that made an image that could be printed? And was it inked or was it emulsion?
Daguerreotype was not printed, it was actually a single image bearing plate on the copper.
There's no paper.
No.
It wasn't
I'll
an
show Ann
It
one
was
when
a
she
pop.
comes in next week.
Okay.
How did it hold the image? How does a copper plate hold an image?
Well, it's the emulsion that was holding the
That's
image.
That's what you were talking
Yes.
about.
Right.
It's the emulsion.
The mercury.
And then the mercury was used to process the plates, the fumes from the mercury.
Yeah, I killed the photographers. Timothy O'Sullivan died younger than Gardner.
Of the pairings in your book, would you mention 2 or 3 that stand out in your mind and why you feel that way?
Well, like I say, the pairings were chosen on the strength of the combination of the old and new pictures. And my favorite has always been the one that now has the new Bowersock North Dam in it. And originally it was taken from the North Lawrence looking across the river at the old Turnpike Bridge. But in it you can see not only Gardner's brother under his figure under the dark cloth of the portable darkroom, but all these other figures, these Lawrence people that were these kids that were following him around, getting in the pictures, and some black washerwomen having a laundry business down by the river, and wagons, and people just posing, very obviously posing for Gardner. And I've gone back and rephotographed that, I think, just about every year, because I couldn't redo the whole series over and over again. It's already kind of out of date. Almost everything has changed since I photographed it, in over 20 years, including that particular image with now the new hydro plant there on the river. But that's the one I did with my iPhone camera most recently, and it's in the book. Yes.
In almost all old photographs, they are very stern and they're not smiling. Is that because they were having to sit so still for too long, or was it because they had bad teeth, or was it because it was just not popular?
It's kind of hard to hold a smile, for one thing, and also it was pretty serious business. I mean, you were paying for it, and often it would be for some reason other than just amusement, you know. Gardner's portraiture of Lincoln is wonderful because he took more pictures of Lincoln during his presidency than anybody else. Matthew Brady did take a daguerreotype of Lincoln while he was running for president. That was very famous. Lincoln said it made him president. But then Gardner had secret service clearance from going back to the Civil War. And so he became kind of almost by default became Lincoln's presidential portraitist. And the two obviously have a very close rapport. You can almost see it in Lincoln's face that he feels relaxed with Gardner. But the most famous one is a very stern look. It was taken right after the Gettysburg Address. And Lincoln, you know, obviously is very serious about what's going on at that time. You can see it in that portrait. I'm sure you've all seen that picture, you just didn't know Alexander Gardner took it.
Repeat again, did I understand you to say that your feeling is that many of the Civil War pictures that we see today were taken by Gardner, but Brady has taken credit for it?
Well, Gardner's sketchbook of the Civil War, which is a huge 2-volume set and covers the whole war from Bull Run to Appomattox, you know, in sequence, in chronological order. And the photographers he took from Brady's studio were the best ones, like Timothy O'Sullivan. And in the sketchbook, he always gives the photographer credit. He didn't take all of them. He printed all of them. And he includes that information, but he always gave his photographers credit for going out and risking their lives to take these pictures. And that's the difference between him and Brady. Brady not only didn't give his photographers credit for the pictures they took, he took credit for them himself. And I don't think he took any of them. I don't think he was capable of it.
Because of his eyesight?
Partly. And, you know, he's just from a different era, photographically. He was a terrific daguerreotypist. He always won these royal contests in England where he would enter his famous portraits of famous people. And I'm sure that's where he met Gardner, probably at one of those. And Gardner was a Scotsman, and there was a old tradition of Scottish photography in England then. Where some of them, my mind just went blank. But anyway, I'm sure the one that photographed the Crimean War.
Oh, yes.
Anyway, you know, they photographed in the Near East, in Egypt, in Greece, the ruins, the first photographers there, and they photographed the Crimean War and a lot of portraiture and all the things that Gardner came over to America and photographed, in fact. Anything else?
Could someone point out on here where this building is? Because I'm not.
Maybe Tim should do that.
I see
Hey,
lots
Tim.
of little numbers, but I don't know.
What's that?
Could you help identify some of the
This
buildings
is a
in the
legend
picture?
for it too, drawn by our local artist and resident, Ellen Duncan. So you come up after, just real quickly. I get a lot of practice with this. People are fascinated
Can
by
I
it.
hear you?
They can hear me, I got a loud enough mouth. And thank you first and foremost, John, for a number of years ago, donating that to Constitution Hall. And there's another one that's over in the City Hall too, right next door. Constitution Hall is number 8. And that's the earliest image of Constitution Hall that I know of. And that's why I wish, before I my demise is that that photograph surfaces somewhere. Up close, up this building where the famous lookout is.
What direction is this being taken?
You're looking to the northwest. So
From
it's
across
taken-
the valley.
Right, to the southeast of here, yes.
And you notice in the foreground, this is what, how I found this location, and why I kind of really wanted to take that view, even though you really can't see across the valley very well, but there's an old church that's been burned, the roof is gone, and across the valley, the foundation of that building is still next to a house there, and you can see the
Catholic church.
yeah, you can see where it was, and that's why I really wanted to pick that spot.
And number 11, that's the ruins of the proposed state house they were going to construct in Lecompton. Congress appropriated $50,000 to begin the construction of the state capitol here in Lecompton. And they got as far as excavating a huge basement. They got the stone laid up to the first floor windows, put in the window frames, wooden window frames. Money ran out. Everyone had a piece of that action. There was like contracts went out to Samuel Jones who built this, Frank Marshall, Marshall County, Marysville. A lot of people were involved in that. They spent the money, $50,000 to dig a basement and first floor windows. That's set as a ruins until the state of Kansas deeded the 10 acres of Capitol Square in the ruins to the United Brethren Church here in Lecompton. So in 1882, United Brethren Church constructed what is now the Territorial Capital Lane Museum there. That's the second home for Lane University. And so the building one block east of here, that's an 1882 building, but I'm sure a lot of 1855 blocks of limestone were used to construct that. And then the original Lane Museum is number 3, and that sits on the other side of the community building, the old Radical United Brethren Church, Rowena Park. That's Lane University. And I always tell visitors that if you look at all the buildings in this photograph, which by the way, most of them accidentally burned to the ground, they were wood frame buildings. Once Lecompton lost the capital, people literally packed their bags and they left. So you had excess homes, excess businesses. I mean, Lecompton boomed and busted as soon as they lost the capital. And if you look at this photograph, you would think, wonder what building should have survived. And you would have thought, well, the Rowena Hotel, you know, it's a 3-story limestone fortress almost. But through the years, it was sold at sheriff's auction. It deteriorated, the roof went bad, and I believe in the late 40s it was knocked to the ground, and the stone was crushed and spread on the roads. Who would have thought that Samuel Jones, famous, infamous Samuel Jones's temporary office building, Constitution Hall, would still be around after 159 years. I'm sure he wouldn't. But those are the some of the highlights. Like I said, I have the legend here. But most of these structures did not survive their gone. But someday, hopefully, you know, and I have hope. Just recently, most people thought that the Topeka Constitution, the first one in 1855, was gone. But somebody found it in a box at the National Archives, and they put it online. So maybe someday an up-close photograph of Constitution Hall will surface. But anyway, after the talk, come up and take a look at this bird's eye view. And I asked John if you'd considered, you know, rephotographing this, and what did you tell me? The bird's eye view.
You mean the one with the cherry picker?
Yes.
Well, I was still intent on taking things as they came. And I later had to alter that because, and if I decided that earlier, I would have taken you up on it. I'd already taken this and still had a lot to go. But the ones in Lawrence, taken from Mount Oriat. In order to get anything above the treetop level, I had to get up on top of the buildings of the KU. So, you know, otherwise I just really wouldn't have had anything to look at but trees. Because there weren't any. You know.
That's all prairie right
There were
there.
none. Yeah, and now, the picture I took here, behind the foundation here, it was still pretty completely foliated, because it was still late summer, really, early fall. You just, yeah, I can identify Constitution Hall and the Lane Museum through the leaves, but I don't think your average viewer could do that, especially someone who's not local here, you know. Yes?
What are you gonna do now that you've finished your 20-year project?
Well, it was really only with the publication of the book that I felt finished, because that's what I wanted to do all along, and it just took that long to finally get it put together into a book. But I'll be 65 next month, and I don't really want another 20 years. I'm kind of keeping my projects kind of in a doable time frame. Yes?
What did you learn about the land and the scenes that you photographed?
Say that again?
What did you learn? From each of the
Well,
ones?
you know, I've been doing this for, it was my job at the survey to travel around the state with survey geologists on different projects and document it for them, for books, their publications, and exhibits and presentations. And I guess I finally kind of learned to work for myself doing this, you know, when it became officially not a survey project anymore. And so I think I learned to work for myself, probably, first of all, at least. And then lots of things along the way. Every photograph and every scene is its own view. I mean, it all goes together into a big series. And so I had to learn what I was looking at and what Gardner was looking at in every view in order to make sense of it and write the captions for the book. And I wrote several articles along the way, journal articles, not only about the Gardner series, but about the combinations of the old and new pictures. And so I learned how to do research for that, what materials, what documents were available to pull together along with the various series images, and how to pick and choose the relevant information that enhanced not only Gardner's series, but the Rephotographing Survey.
Speaking of dangers to the photographer, do you mind telling people about beating the snake with your tripod?
Yeah, when I first met Jim Sherbert, he came to my office, and the day before I'd been out rephotographing around here, actually, down by the river, and there were quarries, and it was in late summer, and there, I was always worried about, you know, stepping on a snake. And when I got home from doing that night, the Grand Canyon book had been delivered to my front door and was hanging on the handle. And down below it was a large, dark snake that had its head up in the air, looking at the package. And I thought at first it was a black snake, but it turned out to be a timber rattler.
Oh.
And I wasn't going to be able to get into the house with the snake there. And my daughter was going to come and visit me that weekend. and the snake had to go. But it was, yeah, so the only thing I had to deal with it was my tripod. I extended the legs and fought the snake with the tripod. And it was a dire battle, really. I did kill it, and then I photographed it. And then I measured it. It was 53 inches long.
Wow.
And while I was measuring it, the rattles started to rattle again. So I went in the house and got a meat cleaver and cut off its head.
Maybe he was there to see his compadres in your book.
Well, what Jim said, well, you're lucky because I understand that the snakes travel in pairs. So I think he was joking. But later on, I was bitten by a copperhead right next to my house. So I've had I ran into a lot of Grand Canyon rattlers doing the Grand Canyon photography too. So I've got this ongoing battle with the snake god.
Where do you live?
Well, my daughter lives in my house out in the country. I moved into town to look after my elderly mother up until last summer when she died. And so I now occupy her house. So I'm always telling Holly, sitting back there, to be conscious of the time of year. But I think I killed most of them. I spent the next couple of summers with a long-handled shovel chopping off copperhead heads and feeling really great about it. They're beautiful animals, but after you've been bitten, you don't want them around. Yes.
How should you preserve like 35mm slides? I've got my father's, they were taken in the 50s, and they're still good, but should you put them on DVDs or?
Well, that's what I do, but I'll let Nancy talk about the preservation.
Well, you can put them on DVD just for access. I don't think I call that preservation. I would put them in some sort of a slide holders. We use safety store sleeves. They're a bit expensive, but you can also find other sleeves for 35mm slides. We store ours in cool storage, a little bit cooler than your room. I would watch storing them in sort of rooms where the humidity and temperatures fluctuate a lot. Maybe make sure there's air conditioning and just so things don't fluctuate.
Moisture and heat.
Moisture and humidity and temperature.
I was reading just recently about the lack of longevity in DVDs.
Exactly.
The ones in
I think they're
zeros.
great for access, but I wouldn't put them on
They
for
will
preservation.
degrade also.
Yeah. Try to preserve the slides.
What sort of photographic donations do you seek?
Well, we seek all kinds. Thank you, Frank. We still are looking for 19th century photography, images that are identified, of course. Sometimes there's wonderful photographs that aren't identified, but we do know they're Kansas because of the photographer. But we're always looking for things like that. 20th century, in views of towns and any kinds of events, agriculture, the whole spectrum of photographs that we're interested in. Of course, now we've entered the digital world, and people send us more digital images, and we do accept those as well. But we store the digital images on our server, and a lot of them we put on Kansas Memory. And you can call me if you have something that you would want to donate. Any other questions for John?
I think almost everybody here has asked.
If not, Nancy, John, thank you very much. If you have questions, come on up. Nancy has a nice display here. John has his book, and there's the image of bird's eye view of Lecompton. Thank you very much for coming out. Hope to see you next Sunday. John Brown will be in the house.